We have some breaking news for you now from Buffalo, New York, where two local stations are reporting that 57 members of the police emergency response team in Buffalo have resigned in response to the suspension of the two officers. Those officers will stay on the force, just not as part of the team. It's response to the video, the resignation, or the suspension rather, of the two officers. Those two officers are seen pushing a 75-year-old man. They were suspended, and now the 57 resignations in alliance with those two. Let's bring in CNN law enforcement analyst Charles Ramsey, who served as police commissioner in Philadelphia and police chief in Washington, D.C. Also with me, Darnell Hunt. He's a professor of sociology and African American studies and dean of social sciences at UCLA. Chief Ramsey, let me just start with you and your reaction to these 57 officers resigning from the emergency response team in support of those two officers who pushed the 75-year-old man onto the ground and then lied about it.
Well, if they want to resign, they should resign from the department. They don't have a vote in what unit that they're in. If I were running that department, they would not be allowed to step down from those positions. If they want to resign from the police department, let them go, and I would not bring them back. It just means you got some slots you have to fill. I mean, that kind of stuff is ridiculous and can't be tolerated.
And one of the things that's interesting here, Chief Ramsey, just to stay on you for one more question, is that, you know, there are a lot of people out here in the world who want to support the police and understand that, you know, most police are probably good people, and also decry police brutality. At the same time, we decry violence in the streets from protesters or anarchists or looters or whatever. But the police force this week, initially the police statement in Buffalo said that a person, that 75-year-old man we saw pushed, the official statement said that he tripped and fell. And that's not what happened. I mean, we all saw it. And then in Washington, D.C., U.S. Park Police originally said no tear gas was used to move protesters before President Trump walked across Lafayette Square Park. But again, that's not true. We saw it. We saw the tear gas. How do these statements, coupled with all this, I mean, how does this cultivate trust in the police?
It doesn't. That's part of the problem. I mean, you could go back to Laquan McDonald and the statements that officers made there. They just simply were not true. Anyone who looked at the video of that 75-year-old man being pushed down and being injured and says that's okay and I'm going to resign over it, you don't need him on the police force, quite frankly. And what was even worse than that, because maybe if they gave him a shove, which was inappropriate, it may not have intended for him to fall. But how do you walk by a person laying on the sidewalk with blood pooling around their head and somehow that's okay? That officer should get a pat on the back and go back to work? No, it doesn't work that way. That's why there are protests in the street right now, because those kinds of actions on the part of police. That's exactly why we're where we are right now. It's an embarrassment, quite frankly.
Professor Hunt, Jabal Bowie, I know you know who he is, and his opinion columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote today, quote, where rioting protesters can be held to account for destruction and violence, rioting police have the imprimatur of the state. What we've seen from rioting police, in other words, is an assertion of power and impunity in the face of mass anger over police brutality. They've effectively said, so what, unquote. What's your reaction to that? Do you understand why some people might feel that way?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous double standard. Let's face it, the problem that we're dealing with right now is one in which we've sort of come to this place where the mentality of policing is that of the idea of the thin blue line, where the police are there to basically be the last line of defense before society descends into chaos. And that particular perspective sets up this us against them sort of dynamic, as opposed to the police being partners, being protectors, being part of the community. And so this whole idea of community policing has just fallen apart. We have a huge cultural problem where you have cultures within police departments that can allow the type of just brutality that we saw in Minneapolis, or the fact that these 57 officers would resign from this particular unit in support of the two officers who pushed down this older man. I mean, that's just, I mean, it speaks to a broken culture and something that we have to fix. And I think that we have to look at incentives and disincentives, structural solutions to make sure this happens. It's more than just about individuals.
Chief Ramsey, I want to get your reaction to this video that captured a tearful police officer telling a crowd in Ocean City, New Jersey, an African-American officer, that the problem, in his view, is lack of awareness of what Black Americans have been going through for centuries. Take a listen.
I get it, because I'm not recognized when I'm out of uniform. So I understand. I get it from both sides. I understand both sides. But the problem is lack of education.
Yes,
Our education system is failing us. We don't teach the real American history of where it comes from. We don't teach about the ancestors, the ancestry of Black people, the Black leaders, what they went through to get here.
Officer Tyrone Rolls in New Jersey. Do you agree that some of the problems we have here that we're seeing protests about have to do with the lack of education about the way that Black Americans have been treated in this country for literally hundreds of years?
Well, I mean, that's part of it. The history of policing in the United States is one that everyone should be exposed to. The young men and women coming on the job today weren't around in the 50s, the 60s, where I certainly was around and I can remember those times. They can't. They need to understand the history of policing in the United States and the fact that when you look at policing through today's lens, police didn't always stand on the right side of justice. And that sort of legacy lingers. People still remember it. And any trust you build is going to be very, very fragile. And you have to understand and recognize it. You know, one of the things I've often thought is, I mean, we all look at the world through a different lens, our own lens, depending on our background. But police need to learn to view policing through the eyes of those being policed. And if they could do that, then they'd understand better where people are coming from. Why is there anger? Why is there bitterness? Why is there hostility? And if we could come together and do that and have honest conversations, it would make a world of difference.
Professor Hunt, when you hear people like the National Security Advisor a few days ago telling me that this is just a matter of a few bad apple cops, what's your response?
That's not acceptable. Again, it's not about individuals. It's about structures. It's about the culture of policing. We have a fundamental problem there. When you can treat people as the enemy, almost as if you're occupying a foreign territory, that's just not acceptable in a democracy. The police work for us. They're supposed to serve us. And a few bad apples doesn't explain why you can have the types of, brutality repeated over and over again throughout history. And the officers, 9 times out of 10 or more, get off.